The history of the West has been mostly Christian.
Diseases, land grabs and outright massacres led to the annihilation of entire communities.
Sacrifice, service, affinity with the victims, courage, and above all, humility.
For someone to say love your enemies, that just sounded foolish.
Put it in practice and you'll have a major contribution to a peaceful world.
From the Centre for Public Christianity, you're listening to Life and Faith. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
So how do people who claim a Christian faith reconcile what happened here with what they believe?
I'm utterly ashamed of it.
The crowds listening to him called back, "God wills it."
10,000 European crusaders broke through Jerusalem's walls.
Religious violence becomes an accepted norm.
That was from the trailer for our documentary, For the Love of God, How the Church is Better and Worse Than You Ever Imagined. And we have a release date. We're rolling out cinema screenings from Wednesday the 9th of May across Australia. And most of these will include a Q&A session with us. You can find the details at betterandworse.film.
It's been an epic feat getting this doco together. Literal blood, sweat and tears have gone into this. Or the sweat is literal. The blood might not quite be. Maybe tears. For me, one of the hardest things has been to cut and condense our material for the cinema release. You can't include everything. But here on Life and Faith, we don't have that problem quite so much. We can share some of our best interviews at length and bring you bonus stories that we've come across in the making of the documentary. So over the next few weeks, that's what we're doing. And we're starting with the interview that we got to do with John Lennox. You might have heard of him or read one of his books. He's Professor of Mathematics at Oxford, a scientist and a Christian. And he's also just really fun to talk to.
There were a few different topics we wanted to get him on for the documentary, like the troubles in Northern Ireland. But when you get the chance to talk to someone like John Lennox, you want to make the most of it. So we asked him all kinds of things. And we started with this: the interactions between science, philosophy and religion.
Often I find Christians are a little bit shy, or perhaps they don't even know what a vast legacy the Judeo-Christian heritage has left in our world. Here am I, a professor at the University of Oxford. What is its motto? Dominus Illuminatio Mea. The Lord is my light. And thinking of the universities as institutions, most of the leading ancient universities in the world were Christian institutions.
I spoke with John Lennox at Oxford, and among the grandeur, the beauty of that place, just dripping with history and kind of important things. And as a Christian and a scientist, he's used to hearing the old chestnut that Christianity has opposed science and other forms of progress. But he says the history shows something very different from that.
It was Christians who gave us hospitals. It was Christians who gave us hospices. It was Christians that were at the base of our human rights legislation. Indeed, Jürgen Habermas, who's regarded as one of the most distinguished atheists in Germany, and indeed on the continent, he talks about this in a very interesting book called Transitions, where he said, when we come to basic human rights, government and all the rest of it, it's been given to us essentially by the Judeo-Christian tradition. We have no other source. And then he adds a most interesting comment: everything else is idle postmodern chatter. Now that, for a man who describes himself as a methodological atheist, is quite something. And also as a scientist, to narrow it down a bit further, people often think there's a conflict between Christianity and science, and I say, just a moment. How did modern science arise in the 15th and 16th centuries? It was a Christian theological background. And, of course, scholars have studied it, and they've come to the conclusion, aptly expressed by C.S. Lewis, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And the founders of Oxford and Cambridge and all the rest of the major universities saw no dichotomy between science and God, so to speak. Indeed, it was their belief in God that was the motor that drove their science. So we owe Christianity a great deal, which is precisely what you'd expect, of course, if Christianity were true.
John Lennox suggests that the fact that we can do science at all may offer evidence of an intelligence behind the natural world.
Now, the pioneers of modern science, starting perhaps with Galileo and then going on to Kepler and Newton, what drove them was the fact that they believed that the universe had a rationale. There was some kind of design element because there was an intelligent God behind it. And science, based on that assumption, was very successful. Now, the interesting thing about contemporary scientists is they still believe that. They don't have God behind it. They often deny God, but they assume the rational intelligibility of the universe. They've got to believe that. And that's a very important thing to observe, because very often one of the polarizations in the debate is to suggest, well, a Christian is a person who believes where there's no evidence. But atheists and scientists don't have faith. And there's a huge intellectual fog out there, in my view, where people just simply don't realize that every one of us is a person of faith. We have a worldview that we believe. Now, how intelligent is it to believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe if you remove God? And I often have fun with my colleagues in putting it to them. I say, well, what do you do science with? Well, they say with my brain, because they usually have given up on the idea of a mind story, been separate from the brain story. Okay, let's allow that. What about the brain? Well, the brain, I mean, it's just the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and say, and you trust it? And they look down, and I say, look, tell me honestly, if you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? No. So how do you make this leap of faith? And then I add, do you know where I got this question from? And they say, no. I say, actually, it's going to surprise you because it comes from Charles Darwin, and it's known as Darwin's doubt. He doubted whether the mind of a human being, which as he believed was descended simply by natural processes from lower minds, could have anything in it at all. After all, he said, what convictions would you imagine a monkey to have if there were any convictions in a monkey's mind? And I see that now as a central issue, which has been taken up by world-class philosophers. Now, I find that utterly fascinating, because what legitimizes my science is the rational intelligibility of the universe. What legitimizes that is my faith in God. And what I say, and it's very provocative, but we might as well be provocative, is that science has certainly not buried God. It's that belief in God stimulated science. But science is increasingly doing a very good job of burying atheism, because the atheistic reductionist assumptions don't go well with faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Putting that a slightly different way, my concept of faith is a commitment based on evidence. Believing in the rational intelligibility of the universe on the basis of an explanation that undermines it doesn't strike me as being very rational faith.
Coming at all this from another angle, we asked Professor Lennox about the natural world and humans' relationship to it from the perspective of the creation story in the book of Genesis. How distinctive is the Christian picture of the physical world?
Christianity, as its best, is not Greek philosophy. There were people in the ancient world, and there still are, that have a sense that the physical world, the tangible world, is somehow evil, so that the best wisdom is to get as far away from it as you possibly can. But in Genesis, you get the exact opposite impression. Here's a heavens and the earth that are created by God. And interestingly enough, you find that the record of creation is stepwise. It's not done all at once. It's done in a sequence. And at each step, God saw that it was good. There's a real affirmation of the goodness of the physical creation. And there have been periods in history where we've lost that. And it has not been affirmed. And so Christians have been rightly accused of being even anti-intellectual and obscurantist and so on. And God is actually interested in his planet. Often there are one or two famous or infamous books that have read the commands in Genesis to fill the earth and so on as exploitative, that go and do what you like with the planet. But that just isn't true. God cares. And you see that in the life of Christ, just little side remarks, God caring for the oxen and so on. He's very interested in the physics and chemistry of the planet and what it is physically, and so should we be. But we're stewards of it. And the most exciting expression of that stewardship is when we do it not by rejecting God and holding on to the physical, but by doing both together, enjoying God's creation. After all, the first story is about a garden, and a garden is a disciplined bit of creation. If you leave creation alone, it goes wild. And that imposing a discipline on the physical planet actually is a very fundamental task, I believe, that God has given to us all.
This idea of creation going wild, that there's a need for taming. Also, the idea that the world is broken and in need of healing, these are ideas that Christianity leans into. John Lennox says that Christian faith diagnoses our world as broken and fractured, but offers hope.
As an explanation of the alienation that we all feel, that there's something wrong, it tells us, first of all, actually quite positively, it didn't all start with me. It's not all my fault. I find myself as an individual, I find weaknesses and brokenness and so on. And this puts me into a huge picture of a story that started before me, before my parents, has been trickling down through history, and immediately enables me, because it says something about this, that you can't put all this right. You didn't cause it all. So you can't put it right. And that instantly shows me that whatever attempts I make within myself to reform my life, they're good, they're wonderful, but they can't deal with the basic problem. And this, of course, serves to highlight the central Christian message, where Christ becomes incarnate in our world and shares its brokenness and actually ends up on a cross. And what we're told about that is that his death and resurrection in some profound way can deal with that fracture, provided I'm prepared to take the step of trusting Christ. Now, many people stop there and they say to me, look, you're a scientist. You can't go along with all this stuff. How would you possibly explain that? And I say, just a minute. You probably believe in gravity. Are you aware that nobody knows what it is? You believe in consciousness, no one knows what it is. You believe in energy, no one knows what it is. You believe in time, no one knows what it is. And yet they believe in these things. Now, at exactly the same level, we use these concepts because they make sense. They do a job. They have explanatory power, even though we don't know what they are. I cannot explain as a scientist or as a human being how it is that the death and resurrection of Christ deal with that fracture. But from the point of view of experience, it actually works. It makes sense. Where other explanations are too superficial to make sense and deal with the problem.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. As the name of our documentary suggests, we are looking at the best and the worst of Christianity, because we're convinced that the Christian faith is positive, life-affirming, transformative, hopeful. But it's also been implicated in some very dark periods of our world's history. Here's John Lennox.
I think that using a religious message for political purposes often loses the whole spiritual dimension that's supposed to reside at the heart of it, so that it simply becomes another kind of political attempt to overthrow the power structures that exist. And this has happened all through history, sadly. Folks take part of the Christian message, but leave out its central appeal that we all need forgiveness and they simply use it to build up their own power. And when they've got their structures in place, then they murder and kill people who disagree with them. I meet many young people and they're put off Christianity. Why? Because they've had a very negative experience of this. And as a Christian, I'm ashamed of it, but we've got to face it. And the only answer to it is getting back to what Christ taught and obeying him. There's no shortcut. And we're ploughing against a huge mass of evidence of child abuse in the name of God, upwards or downwards, and it's a complete mess. Of course, there needs to be put against that atheism hasn't exactly got a wonderful track record for elevating human dignity and so on, but that's another topic.
Something that's often said is that religion, including Christianity, is the cause of all wars or violence. And like with many things we've discovered while making this documentary, it's much more complicated than that.
When 9/11 happened, there was a front page on Der Spiegel, which is the German equivalent of Time magazine or something like that. And it said, with a photograph of the Twin Towers in flames, Gott ist an allem schuld, God's to blame for everything. And there followed 50 pages of ranting at God to blame for everything. And I recall when I debated Christopher Hitchens, whom I liked actually very much and lament his passing at the Edinburgh Festival some years ago, he started giving a 15-minute talk just describing one religious abuse after another. And of course, they weren't all Christian abuses. And when I stood up to respond, I'd simply said, well, Christopher, I agree with you. This is the totally unacceptable face of religion. Now, I cannot speak for religions other than my own. That wouldn't be fair. They've got to defend themselves against the charge. Because clearly, one can see that some religions have violence much closer to their heart than others. You're not going to put the Amish in the same category as Islamist extremists. So there are differences. But I can only speak for Christianity in this case. And I made the point that I've already made, that Christ himself gave the marching orders. You don't take up weapons to defend him or his message. That is simply not Christian because of the nature of the message. How can you propel a message forward by using the barrel of a gun when the message is about forgiveness, peace with God, the love of God, eternal life, and so on? It doesn't fit. It's a monstrosity. It doesn't work at all. John Lennon, not John Lennox, there is a difference between him and me. John Lennon wrote a famous song called Imagine. Imagine a world without the Taliban, all this kind of stuff, you see. And I often say to people, well, I agree with that criticism, but I've written a song called Imagine. Imagine a world without Stalin, Pol Pot and Mao. What about that world? And those who criticize most loudly Christianity are often totally silent on the bloody history of the 20th century. And there comes to mind what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, that he was asked to give account for 100 million deaths in the former Soviet Union. He said, if you want the short answer, it's we have forgotten God. And I will never forget speaking to a very senior academic in Siberia who told me, he said, you know, the problem, John, is this. We thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings, and we found out too late that that isn't possible.
So Russia. This is something Professor Lennox is deeply interested in. He spent years travelling to and working in Russia and Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain was lifted. And he found himself in some very surprising conversations with his fellow scientists.
When I turned up in Russia, it was a time of initial euphoria because everything was loosening up and so on. And I entered there at a time where They were very generous in being interested in my mathematics, and I lectured on it and all the rest of it. But it was very noticeable that even in official seminars in the university, they would politely ask me about my results in algebra, and then they would say, "Can we ask you other questions?" And I would say, "Well, for example, what?" "Well, we hear you believe in God. Why is that?" And then you'd enter a very deep discussion, which would never happen in Oxford or Cambridge or any other university. In a mathematics seminar, you were there to talk mathematics, and these were very prestigious seminar situations. There was a tremendous desire, almost as if a plug had been pulled, and people wanted to talk. But the very revealing thing was they didn't know how to talk about these things. I remember once being in the home of a very distinguished applied mathematician, and about halfway through the evening, he stopped everybody and he said, "Everybody in this room except our visitor," and I was the visitor, "knows that I'm one of the hardest atheists in this town. But," he said, "tonight in my own home, I hear arguments for which I have no answer. Indeed, I don't even think I've got the intellectual processing power to deal with them." So he turned to me and he said very humbly, he said, "You must give me time, because these ideas are so new. I'd never heard anything like them before. You must give me time so that I can orientate them." There was enormous interest in the Christian worldview, especially coming from a scientist. That was their main thing. And in those early days, I got a lot of unparalleled opportunities to explain why I, as a scientist, could possibly be a committed Christian, and managed to publish that in the Academy of Sciences newspaper, for example, and elsewhere. They were very open to it.
To understand this interest in Christianity, John Lennox went on to explain, you have to understand that this was a regime that had literally tried to rid itself of God.
When I went to Russia, I was very well aware of their history, and so were they, especially the intelligent among them, of whom there were many, because their educational system was phenomenal. Their schools, their elite schools for mathematicians and so on, were just like nothing I'd ever seen in the West, because they regarded these like they regarded sport as very important fields. And you had a sense in which there had been real oppression. They were, many of them, completely impoverished. They had to have 2 or 3 jobs. The university would empty at harvest time because the professors were all out harvesting or helping on their little dachas and all this kind of thing. And the thing was that they'd been left in ignorance about Christianity. They didn't know. The most telling evening, I think, was one of the early evenings where I gave a lecture on science and Christian belief. And I said to them about Newton, Kepler, Galileo, and so on, all being believers in God. And I watched, and it was packed out, anger growing, real anger of the distinguished professors, particularly the front row. And I don't like people being angry with me. So I stopped and I said, "Well, why are you angry?" And one of them stood up, "Why are we angry? But we were never told that Galileo and Kepler and Newton and Clerk Maxwell were believers." And he was furious. He said, "Why weren't we told?" I said, "Can't you guess? The ideology you were sold was that Christianity was anti-intellectual, anti-scientific, and now you're learning actually it's the other way around. Why weren't we told?" And therefore, a lot of it was the question of information. I remember one man who said to me, when I asked him, "Do you ever talk about God?" And his answer was, "Well, tell me about England. Do you talk about green cows?" And I said, "No, we don't actually." Well, he said, "Why not?" Well, I said, "Because green cows don't exist." He said, "Precisely." And when you started to say there was evidence for belief in God, that just staggered them. Evidence? There isn't any evidence. There can't be any evidence. So the idea that Christianity might have some kind of intellectual underpinning was totally new. And so you had to proceed very, very slowly indeed. But they were fascinated by it, and they just lapped it up, particularly in those early days.
But of course, efforts to get rid of God and religion entirely tend not to work out quite as planned in Soviet Russia or anywhere else in the world.
Communism never completely crushed belief in God, just as no other ideology has ever overcome belief in God. And I believe that is true because when people come to trust Christ and are genuine, they are not proceeding simply unaided under their own steam. And God gives them sometimes absolutely remarkable stickability, endurance, even under the heaviest of persecution. And it's often been said that martyrdom even is the seed of the church, that people spring up. And it's because I believe that there's something deep within us that resonates with the Christian faith and says, there must be something more, and this is it. And therefore, we have some very heroic stories from all through history of people enduring and spreading the faith. Against that, there was the secularization thesis. And the idea was, following the Enlightenment, secularism will grow and God will gradually disappear. That's been partly true in the West, but those that erected the secularization thesis have now given it up because it simply isn't true. There are parts of the world in which the Christian faith is growing very rapidly indeed, which is another evidence to me. It's not conclusive proof, but it's an evidence that that's exactly what you'd expect if it is true.
From the Centre for Public Christianity, you've been listening to Life and Faith with Simon Smart and Natasha Moore.
For the Love of God, How the Church is Better and Worse Than You Ever Imagined is a documentary from the Centre for Public Christianity exploring the good, the bad, the ugly, and the unexpected when it comes to the impact of Christianity on our world. Don't miss your chance to see it. It's in cinemas nationally from May 9. Go to betterandworse.film to see when a screening is coming near you, to buy your tickets, or you can actually host a screening yourself for your community. That's betterandworse.film.
There are so many great episodes of Life and Faith on our website, publicchristianity.org, or on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Just type Life and Faith in the search box to find us.
And coming up on Life and Faith over the next few weeks, we'll be bringing you more snippets and bonus material from our doco as we head towards the release. Again, May 9, get your tickets.
Next week,
I was actually playing on the street and he shot me once, and when he shot me the first time I went 6 feet in the air with that shot, and then he shot me the second time in the back. That was a kill shot. I was a 13-year-old.
You hit twice in the
Hit twice by the same soldier.